So welcome to this episode of Revolving Door Syndrome. I've got Emily King, who is a food systems expert, former environmental lawyer and author of Refood book and founder of Spira Food System Academy. Earlier this year, we had several severe environmental catastrophes with the Auckland anniversary floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. It really exposed how fragile our food system in New Zealand was, as it cut off food supply to many communities and affected the price of fresh fruit and veg to many New Zealanders. Food system has an obvious effect on public health, as we know that access to fresh fruit and vegetables has direct effects on long-term health outcomes. How we grow, transport and sell food also has effects on the environment. I'm glad to welcome Emily King to this episode. Thank you for coming to this show, Emily. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working in the space of food systems?
Morena Nina, thank you so much for having me here. So I, as you mentioned, work obviously in food systems, and it was a journey to get there. Personally, I grew up in rural Taranaki on a dairy farm. I later studied environmental science and law and went on to be an environmental lawyer for a little while. But I was not quite... I wasn't feeling satisfied with the solutions there that were available to the problems that we were facing, particularly climate change. That was a strong driver for me. And at the time, around 2008 and 9, I started to really question the bigger picture around some of the topics, and I felt frustrated with the Resource Management Act, which is what I was predominantly working under. And I set about to just change and do something that I really wanted to do, and I wasn't sure what that was. I ended up studying a master's, which was a way to change and to reskill and refocus a little bit. And that took me to Europe. And for a couple of years, I was studying abroad at universities in Hungary and Sweden and Greece. And during that process, the topics we were studying tend to focus on energy, water, and agriculture. And with distance from my homeland, I started to see things slightly differently around those topics, particularly agriculture, as in food or the bigger system. Back then, it wasn't really taught as food systems, but it started to be clearer for me. And that took me on a pathway to my master's research, and I was very curious about resiliency of systems, of people and cultures and communities, and also of food. And I researched my master's thesis in Cuba, looking at urban gardens there and interviewing gardeners around their seed practices, because I felt like seeds were the very genesis of our food system, and we could learn a lot to understand about a system if we could look at the seeds and the origins of it. And Cuba's fascinating. I think it's a very unique and unreplicable study environment in place due to its lack of imports and its basically economic and health decline through having closed borders and things. So it's a great case study to look at what happens if you don't have trade and food coming in and out.
So what is happening there in Cuba?
Well, now, this was 2011 that I studied it, so I'm not up with the recent play, but the backstory of it is that basically when at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the borders shut and the main trade, which was like sugar and trade for fuel, closed, and so they had no more fossil fuels, they had no more fuel coming in, and they also had a very obviously communist government that made everybody sort of go back to the land. They were already doing that to try and feed themselves, and the result was really dire, actually. The health statistics for the country, there was a really bad, there was a lot of poor nutrition statistics, people dying of hunger and things like that. But they put in place these urban gardens at the corner of every neighbourhood and ran them and still run them with people to get access to food at the corner of their street. And so, Westerners sort of listen to this and think, oh, this is an incredible solution. And what I discovered when I got there was actually it's I mean, yes, it provides local vegetables, but it doesn't provide all the other things that you need. And also because just one or two skilled gardeners in that area, or perhaps, you know, large operations for public procurement, like big hospital gardens and things that I visited, while they do grow a lot, it's the gardeners themselves that hold the skills around food. It's not the wider population. And so you actually have a huge reduction in ability to understand anything about the food. But they have a ration system for things like coffee and sugar and bread, and huge restrictions on what they can eat. So it is a fascinating place to go and study, but it's definitely an eye-opening place, and I certainly don't advocate for replicating that situation. But in terms of research, it was a great place to go and think about food systems, and it spun me into this journey. This is why I mention it, because it got me really thinking about this topic. And after I graduated, I was still very focused on climate change, though, and I worked in climate change resiliency, running a large urban food systems forum, basically, in a Resilient Cities conference. And so that broadened my perspective, and that was a turning point because I had an advisory board who started to talk a lot more about food systems. They taught me about food systems, and I hadn't had that phrasing before. I'd come from resiliency. I'd come from a background in thinking about how you can, you know, enhance the resiliency of systems to help adapt and continue on in a state. Yeah, so that's basically how I got there, and then I haven't really looked back. I've been working in food systems ever since. When I returned to New Zealand about 10 years ago, I ran the Sustainable Business Network's Transformative Food Project for a number of years, and then in 2017 I set up Spira, which you mentioned, that's my business, and since then I've been training and working and giving advice to businesses and organisations all across New Zealand, and I'm connected still globally to some of the wider food systems change work that happens. And when COVID hit and lockdown hit, I wrote the book because I felt like
what else are you going to do with that time?
Yeah, what else are you going to do with a couple of kids and a few lockdowns? Why not write a book? Yeah. So that's really where I got to today. And yeah, as you know, the book's come out, and I'm trying to grow the conversation nationally around food systems change.
Awesome. So I'm still curious about the whole Cuba thing, right? Because Cuba is a small island. We're a small island, smallish island. We're not that small, but we're an island. And how can we be more sustainable around that? Because we're so even though we grow so much food here in New Zealand, a lot of that gets shipped overseas to export elsewhere, and then we import some garbage, right, to our own shores, and then we feed ourselves, the leftovers, basically. We send overseas the best stuff. I hear time and time again, people are like, oh, I saw New Zealand lamb in the shops in London or whatever, and it was being sold for cheaper than here in New Zealand. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, you've raised many good points there about the food system. I'll just go back to the Cuban point. Cuba is really unique, and we can learn from it, but we certainly don't want that situation. What it highlighted to the world at the time, and still to researchers today, is the reliance of our food system on fossil fuels, because essentially Russia cut the fossil fuels to Cuba, and then because of the sanctions in the States and things, they had nothing. And so, they literally have bullocks pulling carts to plough fields, and no cars, right? The cars are all state-owned. And, yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on Cuba. I actually went to WOMAD a number of years ago and did living books on my experiences in Cuba. So I'm quite versed in talking about it. I'm really not an advocate for this system. I think we can learn from it, but I certainly don't think we want to replicate it. So when we're looking, what it also shows not only is our reliance on fossil fuels, but it's also showing us our reliance on the interconnection of trade in our food system. And it's something that we should never take for granted. And it's something that I'm a proponent of. I really believe that some countries need that in order to get food. And I think that New Zealand is in an amazing position because we have a relatively small population. We have a very good climate for growing food, and we have diverse topography and geography in order to do that. So we can technically feed ourselves and most things, not everything, but we can also export high quality food. So I think, it's a strength of our nation. I want to be very clear that I'm not against exporting food and I'm not against trade.
I hear people, overseas saying, I was at the supermarket and I saw New Zealand lamb and then it was cheaper than, what we had in New Zealand, or New Zealand dairy cheaper than what we're selling it for in New Zealand. And we're so dependent on exports because we have to export so that we can, import, other stuff that we need in New Zealand. But why is it that, some of our produce and meat is sold for cheaper overseas than in New Zealand?
Well, that's the nature of global trade, that we make high quality things and we make what we're good at, or the nation does, and sends it off. And there's trade agreements, obviously, that reflect that. So that's actually why it is that way. But then at the same time, the price of food in our own country, there's complexities there. We live a long way away from other places. So if you're talking about importing as well, it takes a bit to get food to us. For producing our own food, we have relatively high costs for our farmers and growers, high cost of land, wages, also inputs like fertilizer prices are increasing. This is just looking at, I guess, produce and fresh foods, and also regulations which cost them as well to keep up with compliance. So we have high costs for those inputs, and that's reflected also in the price. Then on top of that, at the moment, we have a global food challenge that is the price of food globally. So it's not only New Zealanders that face this problem, it's a worldwide problem. Every quarter it's going up for countries around the world, and that's due to many factors. A big factor in the last couple of years has been COVID, and the impact that that's had on the supply chain. The war in the Ukraine has led to rising prices of grains, due to it being Ukraine being a massive food bowl actually of production, and some countries, particularly some countries in Africa, are incredibly reliant on that for all of their food. So those two things, COVID and the war, and then on top of that, there are climate change impacts affecting the production of food right now. So floods, droughts, fires, affecting countries all around the world. So this is forcing a global price increase, and also there's generally a recession in many countries, which is leading to challenges as well. So it's all sort of like the perfect storm for these rising prices. And then for our own country, for our own producers, they have high costs as well. And some of the reasons that our own producers have high costs is that we have high standards. And so if you're importing food, you're importing the low labour costs and the dubious potentially human rights costs that come with other countries producing it. So they're producing food cheaper. They're producing it cheaper for a reason, and that's often to do with how much they're paying their workers, what they're putting on the food, like how mechanical it is or how highly sprayed it is. Those things they can do because they don't necessarily have the standards that we have here in New Zealand. So there are real reasons for it. It doesn't make it okay. It makes it hard for people to afford food. But yeah, it's a complex set of factors. And I guess my main takeaway there for people to understand is that New Zealand's not alone in this. I mean, we're very insular in our own countries, but everybody's going through some form of this at the moment. So yeah, it's very challenging you can't really compare when you look at our product in another supermarket in another country. Yeah.
Because how can they have, New Zealand beef and lamb overseas selling for cheaper than what we're selling to ourselves in our own country? Yeah,
it's complex, isn't it? I don't actually understand all the nuances of the trade agreements. I'm not a trade expert, but they can sell it that way based on the agreements that they have and the quotas that they're importing, and that is actually,
Because it seems crazy that you'd have to, literally ship this food overseas and all the costs, associated with, shipping things overseas, and yet they can still sell it for cheaper than what we're seeing in our own supermarkets.
Yeah, it's quite confronting for people, and I think that it probably speaks to. It's just part of the bigger food system. So we haven't gone there yet because we've started talking about, we've come in through this way in this podcast, but actually, the food system is global, it's massive, it's interconnected, and trade is a huge part of that. And I think that we need to understand the food system in order to understand some of these reasons why things are happening. And I think that it's only one part of a massive system, the cost of food in other countries compared to our own. I think we should, probably zoom out and look at that bigger picture a little bit to try and get there.
So if we're part of this global, food system, which sounds like it's not as resilient as it, has been in the past, affected by global climate change and, geopolitical issues and stuff, do we need to be moving to a system where we're more reliant on ourselves and able to feed ourselves rather than being reliant on other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits for increasing your own resiliency as a nation. I think you support your own growers more. You also have more vibrant local and regional economies, which is something we'd like to be proud of in our country. And when a shock hits the system, a shock like COVID, like a pandemic, or a shock like an earthquake, or a storm or something like that, and we have a disruption to our food supply, then we can be more resilient as a nation. And so while I think we should continue to have our products out there in the global economy and trade, and it obviously earns a lot of money for our country, but it also provides other people with high quality food too, if you think of it from that perspective. While I think we should continue to do that, I think at the same time we need to constantly look at what we're doing as a country. And I think where we could be world leaders is actually looking at how we make a more resilient food system for ourselves.
What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. What does it look like? It looks like a system where you can produce food in your country that also feeds your people, as well as exporting it. And people, we haven't really done that well. It's got away from us probably since the 80s, when we changed the way we operate around our economics and our trade strategies, for the better for a lot of parts of our country, but also things have changed in the way people live, and we need to also make sure that that's reflected. And people value diversity in their diet. They value the international food that comes to our country. There are a lot of things in the wider food system that has a great benefit for us too, right? To have that exchange of foods. But we also need to make sure that we're thinking about our own resiliency, not only of our people eating food, but also of our own farmers and growers.
So what's happening in the food system now that makes it not as resilient as it could be?
Well, I think we should start, Nina, by actually explaining what the food system is.
Yeah, sure.
Because, people don't all sit on the same page with it, and it's also potentially a bit jargony for listeners. So the food system it starts with our environment, our soil and waterways and air, and it's how we grow food and get it to people to eat. So it's the farmers and growers, the manufacturers and processors, and then the retailers and the sellers of food, and then ultimately whether it gets to people or doesn't get to people, and people eat the food or don't get it. And along the way there's waste that comes off the system, food waste and food loss, and there's also a lot of transport and logistics that happen as we move that food around our country and also around the world, with shipping and sometimes air freight, and then so that's the system as it is, as a food chain. And then ultimately we also have what we've talked about, which is trade, politics, economics, and your interest also in health and culture that comes into that system. So it's a very complex system, but ultimately we're talking about the full system. So it's quite a different way of approaching a topic, because people might be just familiar with their own perspective, which might be going to the supermarket, or if you're living on a farm, it might be, your farm, or you might be a food maker, and it might be thinking about, where you get your food from for your ingredients. So everybody sits somewhere differently in that system. And when we're talking about systems change and we're talking about improving a system, we need to really make sure that we're kind of defining it almost the same, so that we're on the same page. And so when I talk about the food system, and when I did this in my book, Re-Food, I looked at the system. The structure of the book follows the system. It's how you grow food, how you make food, and ultimately how you nourish people with food. And so any conversation around what this could look like better nationally for us and as a country needs to be thinking about that full system, because there's so many parts to it, and it's complex.
And so what's happening in the space for farmers and growers right now?
In terms of, a lot of things. Sorry, just define what you mean by in the space.
In terms of when we're talking about like food resiliency, what's happening in that space for farmers and growers? How can we make things better or easier for them?
Okay, so the lens of food resiliency is an interesting one within that, because resiliency is your ability to adapt and continue on if you have a disturbance. And the main thing that's affecting our farmers and growers around that from a physical sense is changes in weather patterns. We've seen more frequent storms, and drier patches are going to happen in some areas. And so there's a lot of talk around the physical resiliency of farming systems. And then there's also the social and cultural resiliency around mental health and the toll that it takes, the pressures that farmers and growers face around growing the food, the hard work that it takes to produce it, the pressure that they're under to comply with regulations, and also the pressures that they're facing in terms of guaranteeing labour and workers. And then, of course, if a storm or something hits, then it's a lot of stress, because, if you get late snow in spring and you lose your lambs, then you've lost your income for that particular season. So, farming's always fraught with conditions, and it's always challenging. I mean, that's the nature of the game, but we talk about it. I think you can talk about it in a different way when you're looking at that happening occasionally versus that happening like every summer, and the predictability of weather events changing with climate change impacts. So there's definitely a lot of pressure on farmers and growers. I'm
really interested to hear your take on, the agricultural sector, because I think, when we talk about things like the environment and climate change and all that, a lot of the conversation, people give farmers, I think, a really, really hard time, or, some people sort of try to capitalize on the whole pro-farmer versus pro-climate things, as if they're two separate things, as if they're mutually exclusive. But, it's my understanding that farmers are people who work on the land. They probably have some of the biggest investment in making sure that we have healthy environments, healthy soils, healthy animals, healthy plants, and all that kind of stuff. So how can we move to a place where we help farmers and growers be sustainable with their practice, but also productive in the sense that, it has good farmer well-being as well as, good healthy food that's accessible for all of us? Yeah,
it's a great question, Nina. So firstly, there are many amazing farmers doing world-leading practice in our country. I think they get a hard rap. I think it's actually a little unfair. Farmers do feed us. Ultimately, it's the start of the food system. It's where the food comes from. And we should be supportive and rewarding of those best practices and proud of them as well. And I think that's a big part of it. In my book, I say that we need to drink a big cup of empathy and stitch back together the rural-urban divide, because I really believe that both sides of that, if there's any, disagreement there, I feel like empathy is a good a good way through, because there's challenges for both both aspects of that. And, you know, we can't claim to be the world's best producers in terms of sustainability, but we're definitely up there as a country. And of course there are laggards within that, like there are any sector, and there are people that are not potentially up with compliance. It's not everyone, but that gives the whole sector a bad name, when actually we have some really innovative and amazing farmers doing great things in terms of their energy efficiency, in terms of their growing practices, their stocking rates, their waterway protection, and all of those things. And I think that we should be really proud of that. I think we've got it wrong somehow in our conversation around climate, and I certainly do not have the answer to this, but we haven't managed to get it right, and I'm not exactly sure how we navigate that and how we do that in a way, but yeah, it's definitely for me a big question mark around why we haven't managed to have our farmers on board and supportive with climate change policies. And I don't say that naively, I say that genuinely. I really wonder what we could do differently in order to continuously support, you know, the best practice that our farmers have. And it's an extremely complex topic. And
do your parents still farm, or?
My dad lives on his farm. Yeah. It's yeah. So I mean, I grew up on a farm. I understand the mindset that farmers have around this, and how hardworking they are, how connected they are to the environment, because they're out in the elements every single day and they're reliant on them for what they do. But at the same time, you know, we're in a whole different time now. We're in, you know, 2023. By the 2030s, things are going to be quite different for farming, and the expectation from our trading partners now brings us along with these obligations around climate change, around environmental standards, and yeah, it's a really interesting time for farming.
Because also there's something about Nestle wanting to, you know, only buy dairy if it was, you know, more sustainable or more.
Yeah, that's right. So not only is it trading partners putting into trade agreements regulations and requirements around certain environmental practices and climate change, it's also some food businesses are starting to demand it. So, you know, there's a lot of headwinds of change there for farmers, and many of them are listening to that, and I think we should be celebrating those that are, and also understanding why those that aren't are finding it hard. And you know, it's very different these days. Farming isn't small scale family farming, really. We're talking about, you know, mass produced large farms with big operations and lots of workers and managers and this sort of thing. And people are also often thinking about dairy only, but while we do have a lot of dairy farmers, you know, 10, 12,000, however many it is, it's more than that. Farmers are also our, horticulturists. It's also horticulture. It's also sheep and beef. There's also deer. There's also many other sectors, and they often don't get a voice or a sound because of, you know, the narrative around dairy, whether that's pro-dairy or anti-dairy or whatever. I think it's understanding that the diversity and the strength of our food system in New Zealand is that we have a variety of farmers and growers, variety of crops, arable land as well. So
what does, you know, being sustainable as a farmer, like what does that look like? And, you know, there's a lot of people throwing around this idea of regenerative farming, and I'm not sure, like, you know, whether that's the right way to go, or, you know, is it scalable, that kind of thing?
I think terms get used and confused and slightly jargony around things. There's definitely a movement globally around regenerative agriculture as a way through for having farmers produce good quality food while enhancing soil life and soil biodiversity, and also their own mental health. A lot of farmers practicing regenerative agriculture talk about the freedom that they feel from having to be reliant on big fertilizer bills and big debts with some of those things. Of course, that's case by case, but I think, in the global agricultural situation at the moment, there's definitely a big conversation going on around that, and some of the big food companies are picking up on it as, the panacea of this going to solve all of our woes. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. I think it's definitely a good thing if we have better practice around some of our soil and waterways. And
so what is regenerative farming?
So regenerative agriculture, there's a whole... So first of all, it's a little tricky because they don't like to define it as a strict definition, because it's a series of practices that make it up, which, it doesn't help the layperson trying to understand it.
Trying to understand.
Yeah, but it does help them because they can be flexible with their definition. But ultimately, it comes down to soil health and diversity of life within the soil as a living system, diversity of crops that's grown. So instead of maybe growing just grass, they might grow, 50 different flowers and sunflowers and things for cattle to eat that will diversify the diet of the animal, but also the soil microbiology. And it's a very soil focused thing. It doesn't completely rule out fertilizers, and it doesn't completely rule out pesticides, herbicides and fungicides and that completely, but generally they usually are reduced in the practice.
If we keep farming and farming and farming and don't do anything to return nutrients to the soil, then our food becomes less nutritious. Is that right?
There's arguments around it becoming less nutritious. The soil definitely declines and won't go on providing forever. So what this is looking at is regenerating and rebuilding and leaving behind a better thing than what you started from, than continuously taking from it. Diversifying what you grow, but also diversifying plant animals, and also not tilling up the soil. So it's a different way of farming, and the proponents of it suggest that it's not only better for the soil, but it also absorbs more carbon. It's really challenging in practice to measure that, and so I think we'll see in the next 10 years science catch up a little bit. It's really hard for a farmer to measure the change in soil carbon being absorbed every single year. Like, it's actually quite a complex thing to measure. It's not like if you just plant a tree and then you can estimate how much that tree would absorb of carbon. So in the climate change narrative it comes in, but it's also still early days, I would say. Not to say that it necessarily doesn't do that, it's just that the science is still coming in. So farming offers a lot of amazing things that can be done to help produce good food. So there are solutions there, but farming is only one part of the food system, and I think that it's an important part. It's obviously where our food starts. And throughout that system, making food, processing it, and getting it to people to be eaten, so much more happens after the food leaves the farm gate. The farmer gets a price for that, but actually the hundreds, dozens, however many, depending on the product, people in the middle between that primary product.
Tell me more about
getting
that,
to it, right?
For example, a thing that's talked about a lot this year as well is about the supermarket duopoly. They've even put in, like a grocery commissioner or whatever to look at the system and where are the holes, where is the money going, and how can we regulate the sector. So what is happening in that middle space? Where the food is. The food has been grown and now it's in the middle where people are going to process it and, transport it and then sell it, So what's happening in that space?
So, it leaves the farm gate, obviously, and depending on what it is, can go anywhere in the world. And, if it's an apple or something, in some ways it's relatively straightforward because it stays in its state. But if it's an ingredient that's going to be added to something, it can end up in any form in any country, really. The options are endless potentially. So you start to then see the bigger global supply chain kick in. Logistics and freight and transport and packaging is a big part of that too, because you want to have a safe and secure product that reaches that market, but as a result of that, you end up with a lot of packaging and processing happening as well. So it really depends, because there are thousands of foods and thousands of final products, right? So it depends on what you're actually looking at, but ultimately there's a lot of transport, logistics, there's food loss and waste that happens along that way.
Yes, and there's this business that I've seen called like Wonky Box, and I've tried them once and it was great. You got a lot of stuff, but then I went back to Soupy because Wonky Box, they don't come and pick up your boxes every time, so I'm like, I don't want like another cardboard box every time they drop it off. But I think it's a really good idea to take all the food that's been labelled as not like supermarket grade or whatever, and find a home for it, because food waste is a big issue for climate as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising big things there too. Loss and waste. I mean, loss usually happens at the farm, and there's solutions there. Often it's, I don't know, if it's broccolis, maybe it's turned back into the soil or something like that. In New Zealand, most of our food waste happens at the fridge, at the house, or the food service level, and less further on. In other economies, it's a lot more food loss around harvests, because you might have like not a secure supply chain, where you might not have the truck arriving, or there might be a roadblock or a storm or a civil war, or no safe place or secure place to store the grain or something like that. So New Zealand, it's relatively, and it's a trend, developed countries tend to have more food waste at the household level end of it, and then developing countries, it tends to be more around harvesting.
So because recently in the Auckland area, they've introduced a food compost pickup sort of thing, food waste, which is quite interesting, because I think they take it and then they take it over to some processing facility in Rotorua, where it gets processed. I think they collect biogas and then they make some sort of liquid fertilizer to return to the soil, and we've always been doing bokashi, because I think bokashi you can take more stuff in. And I think part of it, the reason why I did bokashi was because I realized we were wasting a lot of food in the fridge, and I was like, I need to feel a little bit less bad about myself. So instead of, I don't know, I try to reduce my food waste, but I'm like, you know what, sometimes it happens, and at least I can do something about it. And so I bokashi, and then I put it in my parents' compost back in Warkworth, because they've basically got a semi-urban garden in their own backyard, which is great. Dad was telling me that he's growing all this passion fruit. They always have heaps of cherry tomatoes. Like they're growing all sorts of things, which is really great. So I'm like, at least my food waste goes somewhere. I know exactly where it's going.
Yeah, that's quite the logistical effort to ship your bokashi up there. I mean, bokashi you add an enzyme that helps break down, and you put it anaerobically into the soil. So you dig a pit and you pour that compost into it, close it up, and it enhances the soil in situ, compared to a compost bin where it might sit for a while, and of course rodents and whatnot love to get in there. So I mean, we've, in that brief part, we've touched on a lot of things. I just wanted to go back. I was talking about the system, and you mentioned about the supermarkets. By the time the products get to the supermarkets, they've been through so many things, right? And that's often, it's the most common point of sale for people, is to go to the store to buy their food from the supermarket. And so we're challenged by that in New Zealand, because essentially there's two main providers of supermarkets. The duopoly, we call it quite openly now. We used to call it that slightly secretly, but now I feel like we're allowed to say that. So Woolworths, which is Australian owned, and then Foodstuffs, which is a collective of New Zealand locally owned and operated brands of stores like New World, Pack and Save, Fresh Choice, and others. Is Fresh Choice under that? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
And so, anyway, there's a few others that come under it. And so basically, we're in a situation where we need to break that up, because that is a big part of, there's people that don't have access to food, but yet we've got these large supermarkets making millions. And in the case of Woolworths, it's shareholders in Australia that are making a lot of money off of the people in New Zealand. And so there's a lot to be done there to break that up. You mentioned initiatives like Wonky Box and Soupy. These are independent food providers that are trying to break up and solve some of these social and food issues by setting up different ways of operating, and getting, a vegetable delivery box from them is one way to support businesses outside of the duopoly if you are in a position to afford to do that. For a lot of people, there's no choice. We also have food deserts where we have no easily accessible healthy food, including supermarket options for people. And people also live really rurally in New Zealand, and it's a long way to drive to get to the supermarket, and that also affects how we buy things and what we buy. Because we can't just, pop to the shop or get a vegetable delivery box of fresh fruit and vegetables. So, we have a lot of factors there to think about, I think, in terms of the system. And so the system's complex. There's way more to it than just farming and growing. Once it leaves the farm gate, it's putting money in the hands of many other people along the way. And then ultimately, when you're paying for that food, you're paying for that process. You're paying for all those different people and places and businesses that handled that food to get it to you. And people, I feel like people kind of forget about all the food businesses that happen and focus just on farmers and growers. They're providing the primary ingredients for all of that, whether it's meat or plant ingredients, but ultimately they all come from the farm and where it's grown. And I think that we forget about all of those jumps in the chain that happen, all of that packaging, all of that potential waste, all of that transport, all of the fossil fuels that happen to get food to your plate. And then, of course, food doesn't necessarily get to everybody's plate. So that's when we start to think about how the food system influences the other systems, which you're so good at interviewing and talking to people about on your podcast. These other systemic issues that happen. And so what I try to do in my work is to give the food system a voice in those conversations as well, because there's a lot to be said for understanding that system and visualizing it when we're coming up with solutions to some of these big crunchy topics that we've been touching on this morning.
So where to next then? How can we make things better?
Well, there's so many great things we can do. I think the first step is understanding that system, and I know that's not for everyone, but it's big and it can be overwhelming. So I always say, sit with that overwhelm a little bit and just think about where your sphere of influence is. So everybody has a role to play in the food system. That's why food is such a wonderful thing, both good and potentially not good. I think where to from here and what we can do about it really depends on that sphere of influence. So everybody that can afford to purchase food is a consumer and can make choices. And I think there's lots of choices that can be made with that purchasing power to understand, where your food is coming from, who's growing it, how packaged it is, what the ingredients are. Obviously, I wrote a whole book about this, so I recommend you go and read that to think about it. Yeah. But one of the key things that I say in Read Food is actually just simplify it for yourself. I think that it's a complex system, but ultimately, if we're eating simple foods that are healthy and affordable, we can do that, right? If we stop the complexities and stop all of the signals that get sent to us from our food environments and from marketers and from all of these things that make us think that we need that convenience food or we need that addiction or that option. I think, we can be powerful in our purchasing power ourselves. So,
I think it's really interesting you bring that up, because I just saw an article the other day and it was about, big tobacco, and it was about how in the 1980s up until 2001, someone did a study on all these food businesses or food brands that were actually owned by big tobacco during that time period. And it was really interesting because someone did a study and showed that actually if a food business was owned by big tobacco, there was a over 30% chance more that they would be, foods that were hyper unpalatable. So food that is essentially engineered to be addictive, food that's high in sodium, carbohydrates, fats, things like Pop-Tarts and Oreos, things like that, and it just goes, and you just think, oh my goodness, like, this obesity epidemic that we have in Western countries, it's completely artificial. Somebody did this to us, it's not something that we did for ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't seen that article and I haven't heard about the tobacco connection, but I'm not surprised. It's an addiction cycle, right? It's an addictive wheel, and I'm sure there's applications to both that they can do. So yeah, the food system is the way it is for a good reason, and that's basically global food. And so we've come into this part of the conversation through talking about the food journey, I guess, of how we get it to our plate. But ultimately, if the purpose of the food system is to feed people, then it's not working. And if the purpose is to feed people healthy and affordable food,
it's definitely not.
And if it's to feed people like sustainably grown, ethically sourced, good food, then and affordable prices, then it's also not working. And the challenges that we face in this food system around health statistics, around obesity, around healthy options to food, and around access to food, these are almost like a cookie cutter approach in every country. And even though we've got cultural differences between our countries, the challenges are really similar all around the world because of global big food and because it comes from the same place. And I've thought about this long and hard, and I just come back to it's got to be money and greed that means that people design these systems in this way. And a lot of people are blindly following it along because we have everything designed in a way that supports it, including our food environments. And when I wrote Re-Food, I was really confronted by the food environments. I knew about it, but I didn't really understand just how much the physical and built environment in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and then, even inside our supermarkets are designed to make us buy food in a certain way.
Right, because the way that, the supermarkets, they pick the food on
the layout,
the ends of the aisles, to be like, oh, this is
well, also, that's also the layout of the supermarket is also who's paying for what real estate shelf in the supermarket.
That's right,
and obviously big global food companies have those inroads in those better aisles. Someone said to me, you should walk around the store backwards on your knees if you want to find the smaller, healthier brands and whatnot. And to a certain extent, that's kind of what you can do. But it's not only the supermarket environment and how that's designed, it's online now, it's how we market it at, it's also on our social media, it's on everything. And so when I talk about people's spheres of influence, you might not realize that in your job you're complicit in this food system in the built environment or in the online environment, and how that's influencing people's choices. So yeah, when we're looking at an example like you've just given around this, global food, and behind it being a big tobacco company with addiction philosophies, it's unsurprising to me. And I think that we're in, as you know full well, this health crisis around healthy food and availability of it, and there's so much of it that comes into this other sphere. So I want to bring it back to Cuba. So what did you learn there? Because obviously, Cuba at that time when you were there, leading up to that anyway, it was a lot more shut off from the rest of the world, or it has been a lot more shut off from the rest of the world in the recent-ish past, right? Yeah.
And so they've had to be more self-reliant. They didn't have, the influences of big food, I suppose, if they were so cut off from the rest of the world. So, I guess that's almost like another extreme. So what did you learn from that, where they had to be self-reliant, they didn't have, big food, meddling in there?
I mean, their health statistics, well, it's interesting because they have quite a strong medical and doctor philosophy. That's a big part of what they do. So medically they have a different kind of health system. But from the food standpoint, it's not healthy. It's really hard work. People are really in a bad way from this, the highly processed foods that you can still get. It's really expensive to buy food in Cuba. It's really challenging. Things like pasta at the time in 2011, that would be, that's a massive treat. tried to find cheese. I don't know what I was thinking. I went to like 6 stores. There's no cheese.
Do they have their own dairy industry at all? Or
no, not really.
So a lot of their food
they
had to be
do.
imported,
They have everything state-owned and state-run. So everything is state-owned and state-run. But then there's the black market for everything. So someone may go to another country and come back and they're bringing in, chips and candy and selling it, and people are getting access to it, or clothing or whatever. So, yeah. But in terms of the daily life, I mean, people had ration cards.
This is in 2011.
Yeah, that they would be going to get, their food, their hard long sticks of white bread, and they did have some cheese. Of course, they have some products. It's not all doom and gloom, but most of it's done on a ration basis. And the health statistics, I don't think it's that great. The food, there's not a variety of diet. Those years under, they called it the special period, but it was awful for them, and that's why I'm massively not a fan of that system, right? Even though it's great they put vegetable gardens in. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to think about it, and it all comes back to, what do you do if you don't have oil? What if you do if you don't have fossil fuels? And everything in the food system is completely tied to fossil fuels. All of our global trade, all of our fertilizers are made through.
Is it possible to move past that?
Oh,
is it possible? I mean, we're all talking about like EVs here.
The scale and the impact and not to live in a way that we think we live now. If I think about it, then it would be extreme disruptions, extremely difficult and really challenging. And while we would innovate and things would be creative, and we might be in a good position here because we have diverse landmass and relatively small population, I think the struggle would be something of epic proportions that no one has ever really completely got their head around.
Because it's interesting, because I feel like there's this movement that, maybe not so much in terms of like specifically about agriculture, but in general daily life, that there's a movement that, if we all just drive EVs, it's going to fix our like climate emissions problem. But then to me, I'm like, well, an EV really is only as clean as the electricity used to juice it up, right? And so, how are we going to move past, fossil fuels completely? I don't know if we can ever do that.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the food system when you said that. And so that was where my framing was coming in, like just how many people are fed by, we have this model of mass-produced global monoculture agriculture which feeds a lot of people. Yes, it's come at the extent of our environment, our Indigenous people, our cultures, and our knowledge and know-how of producing our own food. But it does, to an extent, actually feed a lot of people, and the arguments around that are relatively strong. No matter how you feel about it, if you're in favour of it or not, there are, strong things there, whether you think it's healthy food or not. Ultimately people do get food from it, and how we would bounce back as a society without it would be crazy. I think it would be interesting, but yeah, I mean, there are people that have entire farming operations running on electric vehicles and electric tractors, like the amazing cherry orchard down in central Otago at the moment. That's, I think, the first fully electric farm.
Wow.
We have some really great innovation there, and don't get me wrong, all of those things are incredible. But if you're looking at the full food system and you're looking at like how would we feed people without oil? Well, we could, because we used to do that a very long time ago, but it would be very different from what you're used to today. And I think those experiences in Cuba are very strong for me. I mean, obviously, I've had many other food systems experiences as well, not only that one, but it's interesting to frame it in the context of that and think about it in that way, because it certainly would not be easy. Yeah.
And I was speaking with somebody who lives on Waiheke Island, and they were talking about food systems, and that, there's some talk about, making Waiheke Island in itself more food resilient. Is that something that you're aware of or anything like that, in terms of like them trying to make themselves more, I guess, sustainable and resilient in the case that Waiheke Island gets cut off from the rest of the country? Yeah,
I mean, there's a group, so Waiheke is an interesting case study in itself, just because it's an island off of an island and it's reliant on one freight ship for all of its food. So you pay more because you pay for the freight on top of it, and the fuel is also travelled that way, so that's also expensive on top of everything else. So there's a tension there between availability and affordability of land and housing. So what would have been, productive land for growing is housed now mainly, and it's also steep clay soil, which is relatively difficult to grow on, and it's also requires water, and most people are on tank water unless you have a bore to irrigate. So it's a complex place to grow food, but it's possible. When we look at food resiliency there, we're looking at how we can strengthen our resiliency in times of emergency. So with Cyclone Gabrielle, we just missed a bullet really, and there will be one that comes our way with storms and things. We're lucky that it didn't hit and we weren't cut off. So if we are cut off, there's a whole movement of us looking at how we can be more resilient in the face of that, and how we can combine forces so that we're not reliant on Auckland Council to try and solve our food problems at that time. There's also only one supermarket, which is a Countdown on the island. I mean, there are a couple of smaller Foursquares and smaller food independent operators, but for the most part, it's a monopoly within a duopoly on top of a freight. So although there are other providers that do deliver food from the mainland there, vegetable boxes and other supermarkets, but then of course you're still paying for freight to get there. So yeah, it's a complex one, and all of our islands
is there much growing and farming on Waiheke Island other than the vineyard industry?
There are passionate backyard gardeners, there are community gardens, there are some good growers, and there are some good things. There are large privately held farming operators with sheep and beef that's not really for the island. We're a long way off being resilient in terms of food production on Waiheke. But Waiheke's just one island. We have Aotea, Great Barrier. We have so many islands off New Zealand with people living on them. So it's also something to think about in terms of our resiliency and how we get food there. Yeah,
and it was an interesting thing you brought up before about Waiheke Island and, building houses on land that was once farmed, because I think it's an issue that we're seeing in Auckland as well. When we're having this urban sprawl, we have this, what's the word? Like we just had this reluctance to build up. And so we're, with urban planning, we kept building out and out and out further. And we're building out to places like Pukekohe, with the land being, some of the most fertile soil in New Zealand, probably some of the most fertile soil in the Auckland region. And we're paving that over with concrete.
Yeah, I mean, it's encroaching on highly productive land at the expense of our growers who feel that pressure. And it's a real challenging situation for multiple generations of growers that are then faced with, what do? Do you sell for housing, which is, giving you millions for your land, or, your onions, which are not. So, it's a challenging one, and we need to do more to protect our growers and to protect our soils, because once it's paved, it's gone. And I think that's a focus that, we have soil strategies, but we don't necessarily have food strategies around that. And so, looking at our country, how can we protect and ensure that we're looking after our food bowls? Because ultimately, if we're looking at resiliency, that is where we grow the food. That is how we are resilient.
Yeah. It seems like a no-brainer, right? That the land that is the most fertile for growing should be kept for growing. It just seems like a no-brainer. But I actually want to kind of bring it back a little bit to before you talked about working within the Resource Management Act. What were the issues when you were working amongst that? Because that's like a hot topic, I think, coming up this year.
Yeah, I haven't worked under the Resource Management Framework since 2009, and it's changed a lot since then. So, I mean, we have a framework there, and I guess I haven't really thought about the RMA in terms of its overlap or underlap with food. I mean, we have planning provisions for our highly productive land that have come out, and soils. So, we have protections for aspects of the food system, but we don't have the full food system in mind when we're making regulations, right? So
I guess the food system and the food environment that we talked about as well, I think we briefly talked about it, but in terms of, the food deserts and all that, that's all part of, I guess, urban planning, and that sort of has an interplay with, what we do with land. Do we keep it as farmland or do we rezone it for housing? Because people need homes as well, but then where do we build those homes? And I feel like that's kind of related as well.
Yeah, and it's a big tension, but with the food deserts, like they're not necessarily planned that way. I mean, they are and they aren't, right? Like your food environment is somewhat planned by planners, but we're not necessarily thinking about the economic or the other factors that are going on for people in their lives when they're living in those areas that might be more deprived economically and don't have access to, the healthier options, or they might have unhealthy options available, which is obviously a problem if that's the only option that you've got there.
But I feel like we can at least, you talked about, and I think in some of your articles about like food swamps.
Yeah, there's food swamps. But what I do talk about, which I really love this term, and I want to be more positive about this because the food system brings us great hope and amazing opportunities, despite us traversing pretty much every single challenging issue within it this morning. The food system, the food haven term, which I really like, coined by some professors in Auckland, looking at, pockets of hope within our communities that have really great things happening. And I think what we can and should do when we're looking at this part of our food system, which is ultimately, how people are getting food or not getting food, and how we're designing communities for that purpose or not designing communities for that purpose, and looking at that broader planning framework in which that sort of sits. These food havens can give us hope, and what we can do is look at where we have these opportunities within our communities to create them and how we can connect people across these topics in a better way with food. And so community hubs that are feeding people or growing their own food, empowering people to be more independent with their own food and more resilient with it, not only growing their own but maybe accessing affordable locally produced food. These sorts of pockets of things happen in all across our country. Can
you give us some examples of where it's working really well?
Oh yeah, in Auckland there's a really great example of Papatuanuku Marae in Mangere in South Auckland, and they have some really great, amazing things happening with growing food, with feeding people, training people up. They use the Huaparakori, which is the Māori organics framework system. They also have a connection with getting fish heads and that would otherwise be discarded and waste, and then redistributing them to people to be cooked up and used as a food source. And yeah, I mean, there's endless examples across our country. Because
part of it with the whole, teaching people how to, grow their own food, that part of it is just part of it is just teaching people to understand where food comes from. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's not about everybody having to grow their own food, because that's completely impractical and won't work for everybody. Really, it is. I mean, some people are so far away from the resources and the literacy in themselves or the ability to do that. I mean, it's almost like a bizarre thing that we immediately think that that's what we have to do to get there. It's like some people need pots and pans, and a lot of people are growing up in motel rooms with only access to a microwave, if that. So, we're really everybody's at different levels in our country and our communities in terms of their ability to cook food, grow food, make food. And so empathy comes in there to understand everybody's different situations. And so those that can and are able to try and grow food, well, that's incredible, and it is empowering, and it is a great way to feed your family and your community if you can. But it's also recognising that people can't all do that, and so community hubs that help provide food at an affordable price or rescue otherwise food that would otherwise be wasted. These sorts of initiatives that happen across our country provide opportunities for people to tap into those parts of the food system and access food. And, you know, there's just more and more of them popping up.
Oh, that's really good to hear.
Which give us hope, right? But some of it's ambulance at the bottom of the cliff kind of stuff, which isn't ideal, and it leads into, you know, bigger conversations around other systemic issues as to why we have people not being able to get food in the first place. And access to food is a topic in itself, like, you know, affordability, whether you can physically get it, you know, how you make it once you get it, all these things. There's many aspects to it that I think can be taken for granted, and the nuances of it can be kind of lost as people just sort of broad brush say, oh, you need to grow your own vegetables. There's a lot to get to that place. If we're honest about it, there's a lot to get there before you can even.
Well, I mean, like,
think
you know,
about
having
that.
You know, modern civilization or whatever you want to call it, you know, where we have agriculture, you know, means that we can outsource, you know, the growing of our vegetables to people who are specialists in doing it, and that's what allows us to have scientists and lawyers and doctors and nurses and whatever, is because we're not busy doing the growing of the vegetables, so we can do some other stuff.
Yeah, it's our agricultural system. It's how we've designed it, and we have to think really hard about that, right? It's a really great thing to bring in when we're looking at society. You know, we have all these potentially idealistic ideas of what this, you know, food systems change or this post-growth thing could look like, but then you've got reality, because do people actually want to stop doing their convenience shopping or whatever it is and actually do these things? Well, no, not everybody does. And so, you know, it's the realities of some of these discussions are really confronting, and I think they're really big conversations that we can have. And I think not, you know, just the grow your own food is a good example of that, because it's often, you know, touted
not
as
everyone has a garden, not everyone has the time, not everyone has
the
the
know-how,
skills.
the skill, the understanding, the ability.
I think, at the crux of it, I think access to at the crux of it, access to healthy food is a public health priority. It's an economic priority.
Well, and the right to food is the human right to food, right? It is a human right, and we all have that. And so are we upholding that human right as citizens through how we are operating in our sphere of influence? I think it's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
And I think if we don't fix it, right, it's going to cost us in the long term. If it's not costing us now, it's going to cost us in the long term.
Yeah, and these problems are not going away, and they're not going to get easier, and they're not going to get cheaper, right? So things just, you know, continue along, and we need to find a way to navigate through the headwinds of change around, you know, climate change, storms, fires, droughts, global food supply, disruptions from war, all of these really big, heavy things, economic recessions, you know. How do we navigate through this in a way where we, you know, maintain our own mental health, that of our communities, but also our resiliency, our resiliency as people, and, you know, just look back generations and see that, you know, four grandparents did this in times much harder, and people did, and some didn't, but did survive, and how we build that resilience in. It's wired in us as humans to survive, and to survive in our food system. And I think, I like to think there's enough people savvy enough out there that can help make that happen, to make up for, you know, those that aren't in a position to. But they're definitely big conversations, and I don't have all the answers at all to it. I like to help.
What? Didn't you write like a whole book about it?
I wrote a book about the problems. It's up to everyone else to come up with the answers. No, I really want to I think the first thing is understanding it, right? Like, this is incredible. A few years ago, there wouldn't have been a podcast looking at food systems, right? People still don't know what that term is. I think busting the myth around jargon and understanding what it is provides us with an opportunity to come up with some solutions. And so I work with organisations and businesses on this around the country, and a lot of it comes down to, and I say this often about empathy, but it's true because there's different parts of the system that need to come together and to come up with solutions and answers, and to have robust and frank dialogues with each other on perspectives that might be different, to come up with solutions. And I think, this is why I welcome coming in and speaking to you, because we're, coming from different perspectives, perhaps from other systemic health and societal issues, but bringing the food system in and having that voice is really important, right? Because if we're going to affect change and we're going to make change, we need to have different people with different perspectives coming around the table. And so, I wrote ReFood to continue, to try and catalyse that change, but to get people to actually understand a little bit more about the food system, to give it a voice, to give it a visual so that people can think about what it looks like, and then to question some of the things that we just take for granted in our day, and ultimately try and take some action, because if we just think about it, we end up with overwhelm or inaction and all of those things. But, there are different ways, and I keep coming back to, your sphere of influence is really different for every person. And, yours might be your podcast sharing information this way. Someone else's might be that they work in a marketing agency and they hadn't realised that they're actually enabling unhealthy food environments for the last 24 years until they heard this, right? Your sphere of influence is potentially bigger and more in front of you than you realise. Yeah.
So we're going to wrap it up because I've taken up enough of your time, but I'm going to close with one last question. We always do these fun questions at the end of the podcast, and we've been going on and on about fresh food and fresh vegetables and all this kind of palaver. But for you, what is your favourite takeaway fast food?
I don't really.
What's your guilty pleasure when it comes to food?
I mean, I like sushi if it's available, because I don't have sushi available. I mean, where I live, we don't have fast food options really. I mean, apart from maybe fish and chips, which is everywhere, I guess. So I like a good sushi if I can find it.
Do you have a favourite sushi shop? It's the one in Commercial Bay, the OG sushi place. They do some nice sushi. And your favourite sushi item?
Probably the avocado and tofu option there. They do a good vegetarian variety, which I enjoy.
Vegetarian sushi, that sounds like an oxymoron.
Yeah, it probably is for some. I'm kind of failing on the takeaway thing. I'm not a big fan of takeaway, but I must admit I like going in and sitting down for different foods, and so I mean anything with diverse flavours. And
what, KFC's not good enough?
They apparently have a lot of flavour.
It's my favourite.
I'm kind of I'm probably a little boring in that regard, and we don't have a lot of takeout options on Waiheke.
This is true.
Which I personally find great, because the food environments are.
Your kids aren't asking you for Happy Meals?
Not yet. No, and I'm probably just over 20 years since I had any kind of takeaways like that.
Wow.
Yeah, I probably was about coming up 20 years since I would have had anything like that.
Take that, big food.
Yeah, definitely take that. But I love food, don't get me wrong. I love dining out and eating tasty, yummy food. I just don't buy into supporting global food that's really messed it up for a lot of people in their lives. I don't subscribe to supporting them with my hard-earned dollars.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure, Nina. Thank you. It's been lovely to chat to you today, and just to go through some of these things. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Revolving Door Syndrome acknowledges Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We recognise the inequities and challenges faced by Indigenous and vulnerable groups and acknowledge our duty to work towards closing the gap.